Everyone, to those of you who do not know me, my name is Elissa Koblas. I am the president of the trial team here at UCF. First and foremost, I want to say thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you for getting on your computers and fighting through the firewall to come and see us. We really appreciate your support, and it's great to meet all of you. So that being said, before we begin our presentation, I kind of just want to run down for all of you what trial team is, essentially, for those of you who don't know again. So trial team essentially, on the undergraduate level at least, is where multiple colleges and universities across the country receive the same case packet, us included. And within this case packet, essentially, there are witness statements, there's evidence documents, and we also have like statutes and stuff that we can work with. And essentially what all of these schools and their teams do is we create a case on both sides of the case. So we'll prepare a state case and a defense where we're gonna have people playing attorneys, people will play those witness statements. And from that point forward, we go ahead to trial where we compete against other schools. And this is, I would say, as close as you can get to a real trial on, of course, the undergraduate level. If you did high school mock trial, this is a little bit more advanced. And if you plan on doing law school mock trial, this is like something to get your toes in the water. So essentially, this case that we are going to present to you is called the State versus Jordan Ryder. And this was the case that we competed with as Dr. Koblas, my mom said before. This is what we competed with the past year. So instead of giving you guys an actual trial over Zoom, because those of you who are interested, trust me, you'll have all year to do this when we compete. We thought we would do something more fun. As she said before, it's basically like a Nancy Grace, a 60 minutes, except it's going to be much shorter, 30 minutes. It's much easier for you guys to digest the information, and it's just a fun way for you guys to get to know us. So with that being said, we're going to begin tonight's episode of 30 Minutes in Midlands. Woo! Alrighty, everyone. So welcome to 30 Minutes in Midlands. My name is Elissa Koblas again, and I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Costa Muniz.
That's right, Alyssa. Tonight we have a tragic story straight out of Midlands about a 12-year-old girl named Parker Page who fell to her death.
Yeah, Costa, and the interesting part about this story is that Parker Page suffered from health issues. You're going to later find out, our audience, that Parker Page suffered from something called brittle bone disease. And now investigators pointed obviously to her father, who she was with during that weekend, as being responsible for this case. And it's important for you guys to also know that this has already been tried. So now we're just going back and reviewing all of the evidence.
That's right. So let's get started.
Yeah, so our first person that we're going to bring to you guys from the case is actually the State of Midlands lead investigator, Miss Detective Chesney. Thank you for joining us tonight, Detective Chesney.
Thank you for having me.
So Detective, first, I want our viewers to get to know you a little bit. Do you think you could tell us about your experience as a detective?
Of course. So I started working for the Midland Center Police Department about 10 years ago. And for the past 5 years, I've been the primary detective for the Midland Center Police Department.
And now, Detective, how did you get involved in the Parker Page case?
Well, I was called out on a missing child report, and I arrived at the campground to talk to Jordan Ryder, where I first met him. And I immediately thought it was odd because he was actually asleep in his tent, which I thought it was odd that you'd be asleep when your child was missing. And then after waking him up to talk to him, he was stuttering a lot. He seemed to be talking very quickly, avoiding eye contact. So the whole conversation just seemed a bit odd right off the bat.
And in fact, Detective, reports that we read actually said that it was so odd that you ended up arresting Mr. Ryder before you even began the search. Can you tell us about that?
I did. I was trying to find out information about the missing child, and Jordan Ryder was more concerned about whether he was violating his parole violation. And in my 15 years of experience, I never once met somebody who was scared of being in violation of their parole when they weren't. So I went ahead and put him under arrest in suspicion that he was in violation of his parole.
And so what was your next step after that? I assume searching for Parker?
Yes, we actually went on to the Lacrone Loop where Parker Page was last seen to search for her.
And how did that search go? How did your team do on the campground trail? Can you explain it to us?
It was definitely a little difficult, as you can see on this map here. The Lacrone Loop is definitely not a beginner's trail. It's very, very steep at parts, very narrow. There are trees and rocks overgrown everywhere. We actually had a whole investigation at some point because it got too dangerous for our team, which also struck me as odd that Jordan Ryder would take his young disabled daughter to hike on a trail like this when on my professional team had struggles doing so.
Absolutely, that does seem to raise some red flags. And now, Detective, can you tell us about when you found Parker's body?
We actually unfortunately found Parker's body 40 feet below the cliff um, that day.
And I assume at that point, your next step was going back to the parent, right?
Right, of course. Next, we interviewed him at the police station.
Can you tell our viewers a little bit about how that interview went?
It just continued to get more and more odd as we were getting into the interview. I brought up a life insurance policy that Jordan Ryder had taken out for Parker Page and asked him a little bit about that. And his response was he took it out because it was a lot of money and he had just gotten out of jail and didn't have any money. So he figured that if she were to happen to die, then he could get that money, which I thought was very strange that any parent would think about their child in that way.
Wow, no, that's shocking, of course, to hear. And I assume at that point, that's when you arrested Jordan Ryder again, right?
Yes, of course. That's when we went ahead and wrote his arrest warrant.
Now, according to the reports, you guys actually started off arresting Jordan Ryder for aggravated murder, but then later switched to involuntary manslaughter. Can you just explain that to us a little?
Right. So basically, we didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the murder. However, there is no reason that that child should have been left on that very dangerous trail. So we were able to go ahead and charge him with manslaughter for the death of Parker Page.
Wow. Well, thank you for coming out tonight and giving us your side of the story, Detective. We really appreciate your perspective as an investigator, of course.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right. Good night, Detective.
All right, Alyssa, that was really fascinating. Now we're going to jump to Armani Rodriguez, the campground owner. Good evening, Mr. Rodriguez.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the chance to tell my side of the story and what happened that tragic weekend.
Well, thank you for joining us. Mr. Rodriguez, our viewers have heard about this case in the BNN reports. They've heard about how Parker Page unfortunately did die at your campgrounds. Could you tell us a little bit about the Calkins campgrounds?
Absolutely. I bought the campgrounds about 10 years ago. Thanks to my expertise and know-how, we've turned the campgrounds into a really lovely place to go. It's got 12 cabins, campsites rather. We have 4 cabins. We have 3 trails, and it's been called one of the best places to camp here in Midlands.
Okay, so they camped there that weekend. Can you tell us a little bit about that morning when you checked them in?
Absolutely. They came in around noon. I had just finished eating some veggie hot dogs from Meatless Midlands. And it was a pretty typical father-daughter interaction. Nothing seemed unusual, save for the fact that Parker was a little small for her age. And she didn't seem to be too thrilled to be there at times. But other than that, I checked them in, I wished them well, and they were supposed to have a great weekend, but unfortunately, Parker passed away.
Okay, so you said Parker looked small, but you said they looked normal. Did you see them again that weekend?
I did. I saw them a couple times, checking in on them here and there, but I didn't really interact with them until Saturday afternoon when I went to go check out a scream that I heard on the trail.
And what happened when you got to where you heard the scream?
Well, I had just finished watering some of the plants that I just planted, and I heard a scream coming from Lacrone Loop. So I ran past the warning sign down the trail, and that's when I ran into Jordan and Parker.
And what happened when you were there?
Well, there wasn't really a lot to see because Jordan was blocking Parker from my view. Before I could ask Parker if she was okay, Jordan chimed in and said, oh, we just seen a fox. Parker's being overdramatic. Shouldn't you be going somewhere? And, seeing wildlife is common on the trail. So I didn't really think much of it and I left. until I heard a second scream shortly thereafter, which prompted me to check in on them later that evening.
So just to backtrack a little bit, Mr. Rodriguez, you said there was actually a sign on the trail?
Yes, I did. There is a warning sign. Back when I first bought the campgrounds, there wasn't one. And I bought it contingent on the fact that the state would insert one. So we have this bright, big, yellow, bold warning sign. It talks about the trail's elevation, the fact that there is steep inclines at certain points. You need to climb with iron rungs. The fact that small children and people with fear of heights really shouldn't be on it. Just the kind of things to warn for less experienced hikers.
And have there ever been any accidents on the trail prior to this?
Yes, before I bought the campgrounds, someone fell off of the Lacrone Loop, which is why when I bought the grounds myself, I made sure the state implemented a warning sign right out at the very front of the trail. It's bright, bold, yellow, and it's just as obnoxious as it was when they first installed it.
Right. So going back to what you were just telling us about on the trail, you heard two screams and then you later returned. Did you see them at the campground that evening?
I saw Jordan. I didn't see Parker, which was very alarming given what had happened earlier that afternoon. So I asked Jordan where she was, and he told me that, she was alive and well, sleeping in the tent after a long hike, nothing to worry about. And, Costa, that would have been really well and fine, but I looked into that tent and nobody was there. So I asked Jordan again, and he changed the story on me.
Wow. So at what point did you decide to call 911?
Well, after Jordan changed his story and then snapped at me like it was time for me to leave, I became increasingly worried that Parker wasn't there. So I called the police, and they told me the soonest that they could send somebody out would be that next morning, which is when I met Detective Chesney.
And did you assist the detective in any way?
I did. Being the campground owner, I'm a frequent hiker of all of the trails, so I helped lead one of the search parties. We had to stop the Lacrone Loop a couple of times because it was difficult, but ultimately we found her body at the bottom of the ravine.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rodriguez. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alrighty, Costa. Well, our next guest is going to be actually from the defense side of this case. So now we will be hearing from Miss Doctora Lopez.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us, doctor. So first and foremost, again, let's let our viewers get to know you a little bit. Can you tell us about your background as a doctor?
Yes, of course. I studied forensic pathology, and then I became the medical examiner for the county, where I worked as a medical examiner for the past 25 years. Recently, I started my own consulting firm to review autopsies and work on the autopsy to determine the findings and cause and manner of death.
So is that how you got involved with Jordan Ryder's defense team?
That's right. They retained me to double check the work that the medical examiner did, and based off of those findings, determine a manner and cause of death for Parker Page.
Well, let's first break down Parker Page's health, because you're actually the first medical expert we have in here. Can you explain to our viewers what exactly brittle bone disease is?
Yes. Well, Parker was 12 years old, and for the past 7 years of her life, she had been diagnosed with brittle bones disease, also known as osteogenesis imperfecta. That's the scientific name. And essentially, this disease makes a person's bones very vulnerable because they have less bone density than the average person. And this caused her to suffer several fractures throughout her childhood, actually. Aside from brittle bone disease, she also had asthma, which affected her lungs, and she had to be on 3 different medications to treat all of these conditions.
Were any of these medications found in her system when you reviewed the autopsy report?
Actually, no. That's why I thought her medical conditions were a huge contributing factor to her death. Her not having any medication in her body during the time of death definitely indicates that she was suffering symptoms from either of these conditions, and that could have caused her death.
Can you explain how these conditions, a little bit more in depth, how they could have led to Parker Page being at the bottom of a cliff?
Of course. So as you heard from Detective Chesney earlier, she mentioned how challenging this trail was, the Lacrone Loop, how it was very highly elevated and narrow paths and rocks, overgrown roots in the paths. The way that the nature of this trail and the elevation could have possibly triggered respiratory illness, respiratory difficulties, and her losing her motor skills. Here you see a picture of the trail and a very steep cliff on the side, which is actually where she fell off of and fell to her death. I also do have a diagram showing how this fall impacted her body and caused her to die.
Yeah, let's see. I think our tech team is trying to pull that diagram up for us now. All right, doctor, can you explain to us what we're looking at?
Of course. So here you see the diagram of Parker's body. You see the red marks and lines corresponding these red marks. So these red marks are the bruises that you see on the outside, and the corresponding fractures, which just indicates how easily this child would break, honestly. So here, an outstanding bruise that I see is number 2 on the clavicle. So this was likely caused by her hiking staff, which was found near her body during the time of death. And if you can see my little icon right here, we'll be using both the diagram and the icon here on the side to demonstrate how Parker fell to her death. So she had the hiking staff on her left side, which caused the bruising on the clavicle. It's very likely, based off of where her body was found on the trail, that she stumbled upon a rock or overgrown root in the trail, which caused her to trip. And since she has a hiking staff on her left side, she's going to trip to her right and fall this way, which, as you see here, all these bruises aligning on the right side of her body, on her head, her rib cage, and her knee. All of these are consistent with the fall I just described, accidentally falling off the cliff with the hiking staff, and the one hit to the head here, bruise number 1, the blunt force to the head, is what ultimately caused her death.
Wow, doctor. So from what you're saying in your analysis, it seems like this was a pretty fragile 12-year-old.
Absolutely. And when I conducted the autopsy and reviewed her lungs and the collagen in it, it's very likely that she suffered multiple symptoms from her medical condition, which caused her motor skills to be impaired and fall to her death.
Wow, doctor. Well, thank you for your analysis, and thank you for these visuals too. We really appreciate you coming out again. So thank you, Dr. Lopez.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to give my testimony today.
All right. Have a good night, Dr. Lopez. Now, here we are with Costa again.
So I just got word from our tech staff that the Midlands Penitentiary is actually having some Wi-Fi difficulties. We were going to speak to the defendant in this case, Jordan Ryder.
I think that Jordan Ryder is actually entered. It looks like the penitentiary connection is working.
Oh.
Yeah. There's
Excellent.
so many people in here. It's hard to see where Jordan is, but he's here.
Jordan, are you with us?
Yes, sir, I am.
Thank you for joining us tonight, Mr. Ryder.
Yeah, after a lot of troubleshooting, I'm very happy to be here.
So, Jordan, our viewers have been writing in about this case. They have been following it on the wall-to-wall reports. Can you tell us what really happened that weekend?
Well, that weekend, my daughter and I had decided to go camping over at Calkins Campground. We checked in with Armani Rodriguez, who was very nice, took us to our campsite, and had suggested us to go onto the Lacrone Loop.
Okay, and so I think the question that comes to all of our viewers' minds is, why did you take your daughter there that weekend?
Well, I had just gotten back from being away from her for a very long time, and I just wanted to spend some quality time with her. And I thought that, taking her out there, getting her a little exercise in a safe environment would have been ideal. But after seeing what the Lacrone Loop actually was, we turned back. We got around like maybe like a quarter of the way there, and then I saw just like all like the terrible like vines and the cliffs and the overhangs. It was too much for her, and we had decided to head back to camp.
So how did Parker do on the actual trail?
For the first bit of it, whenever it wasn't too steep or hard on anyone, she was doing great. It was really hot though, and she was getting a little frustrated, and so was I. And then that's whenever we had seen how much worse it was going to get, and so we had taken back. We had bickered a bit, but whenever we got to camp, I promised her I'd make her some s'mores.
So you decided to turn back, and did you see the warning sign before you got onto the trail?
Personally, I did not. It might have been covered by some tree branches, some vines. I'd seen it, I wouldn't have taken Parker on that trail.
So Parker's condition, that didn't concern you at all?
Her doctors had suggested some like mild exercise would be good for her, and getting outside would be good for her. I had no idea how terrible the Corona loop was going to be.
Okay, and when you got back from the trail, you got back to the campground, when was the last time that you saw Parker?
Well, like I'd said, things were a little tense between us. We had been bickering a little, but I had promised her that I would make her some marshmallows, and I left, gave her some space for a couple minutes, and when I came back, she was gone.
You didn't know where she was?
I had no idea where she was. I searched high and low on the campgrounds. I stayed up nearly all night until I ended up passing out in my tent, and then that's when I woke up to the detective shining a very, very bright flashlight in my eyes.
So we actually heard from Detective Chesney that there was an insurance policy involved in this case. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had taken out the insurance, or I'd started the insurance right after my spouse Terry had passed away, and I wanted to make sure that Parker would be able to have the money to be able to pay for any medical bills that she would have.
So you wanted the insurance policy to be able to pay her bills?
To be able to take care of anything that she would have needed to take care of, and then also you're able to take out a small deposit from it, and I was hoping to use that to put down a down payment for Parker and I to be able to live in an apartment together. Yeah.
Okay. So do you feel personally that you had a fair trial?
No, and per discretion of my legal counsel, I've been instructed not to go into the details of it, but there were some instances of a mistrial within the case itself, and we are looking to appeal it and actually find the person who is responsible for my daughter's death, which would be Armani Rodriguez. We plan on suing him for the damages.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mr. Ryder. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties.
Thank you for having me.
Alrighty, and we're back. So now we are actually going to interview some of the attorneys involved in the case. So first, we're going to talk to the state, as we would normally hear from them first in trials. So we will be joined now by State Prosecutor Miss Alicia Foley.
Hi.
Hi, Miss Foley. Thank you for coming out and joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ms. Foley, first I got to ask you, what was the state's reasoning? We heard a little bit about it from Detective Chesney, but I'm going to ask you as the prosecutor, the legal side of it, what was the state's reasoning from going from that murder to manslaughter charge?
Well, we knew we didn't have enough evidence to prove the murder charge, so we had to make the decision to pursue a lesser charge that we knew we could prove. We knew that Jordan brought his daughter to an extremely dangerous place and left her there alone, so we just wanted him to be held accountable.
And so what was your strategy going into the trial against Jordan Ryder? What was the state going to present to the jury to make sure that he was held accountable?
We just wanted to create a picture of how easy it could be for anybody to get injured on the trail because of how difficult it was. Once we created that picture, we took the eyewitness testimony from Mr. Rodriguez about the interactions between Parker and Jordan and the screams that he heard. And then we added the investigation from Detective Chesney to add even more details into how difficult the trail was and to lay out all the events that took place that weekend.
And now we heard a little bit about Jordan Ryder having a previous record. How exactly were you trying to portray him to the jury?
We just wanted to portray him as the negligent father that he was. I mean, he brought his own extremely sick daughter to a campground and brought her to a dangerous place, then left her there alone.
I couldn't agree more with you, Miss Foley. Now, the last question I have for you is, do you think that Jordan Ryder was truly guilty in this case?
Yes, at the end of the day, Jordan made the decision to bring his extremely sick daughter to the campground, and then he chose to bring her onto the Lacrone Loop. And if we can pull up a picture of that warning sign, you'll see that it was a bright yellow warning sign right at the beginning of the trail, and you can see that there was nothing blocking it. So it would be pretty hard to miss, nearly impossible, I would say. So with that at the beginning of the trail, Jordan would have been made aware of the dangers, and then he still brought his daughter on it and then chose to leave her there alone. One way or another, Jordan was responsible for Parker's death.
Yeah, I mean, and I can see, Miss Foley, how this would have been an important piece of evidence for you guys in a case. If our viewers are looking at this sign right now, you can see it says falls on the mountain have resulted in injury and death. It talks about small children on the trail and even this vertical route that it has. So I can definitely see the point that you're making about being negligent with this child, Miss Foley. Alrighty, if Tech can go ahead and take down that. Thank you, Tech. All right, so thank you for joining us tonight, Miss Foley. That'll be all from you, but we appreciate you coming out and giving your side.
Thank you for having me.
Alrighty, and here's my co-host again.
So now we're going to go and speak to lead counsel for the defense, Miss De'Erica Jackson. Ms. Jackson?
Hello.
Hi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Ms. Jackson, what are your thoughts on how this trial went?
Firstly, I think that Jordan should have got the justice that he deserved, especially since he lost his one daughter, who was very sick. And I just feel sorry that Jordan couldn't be sad, couldn't grieve over the loss of his daughter because of the trial and being placed in jail.
So is there going to be an appeal?
Yes, this case is not unique. The negligence of the campground owner, Armani Rodriguez, is what led to all of the evidence coming out against Jordan that really put him in a bad light against all of the other circumstances that day. So we're going to go for an appeal to get Jordan the justice that he deserves.
Ms. Jackson, can you tell me why it's the defense's theory that Mr. Armani Rodriguez was in fact guilty?
Well, he knew that Parker had some sort of medical condition. And you could look at Parker and see that she was frail for her age and smaller than usual. And yet he still recommended the most difficult loop on the campground for Jordan, an inexperienced campground walker. He has never walked on a campground before, and Armani Rodriguez recommended the hardest loop. So this negligence, it shows that he does not care for his campground users, and this isn't the first time that someone has died on that very same trail.
Wow, so people have actually died on this loop.
Yes, we found that just the year before Parker Page's death, another child had died on the Lacrone Loop, and Armani profited off of the death. He made it seem like it was haunted and scary so that he can raise the prices on it.
So as lead counsel for the defense, can you tell us what is going to be done about this?
The Midland Supreme Court has already picked up the case, and hearings will start next week. Hopefully, able to use the law to our advantage and apply for an appeal to hold the real enemy here, Armani Rodriguez, accountable and free Jordan Ryder so that he can properly grieve for his daughter.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ms. Jackson.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Alyssa, it looks like this case leaves us with more questions than answers.
No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think ourselves and our viewers saw it best that while it looks like legally Jordan Ryder is probably responsible for his daughter's death, however, his defense does raise a very interesting point about Armani Rodriguez and about Parker Page's health.
Well, now that it's been confirmed that there will be an appeal, I don't think this will be the last that we'll be hearing about this case.
Nope, and we'll be there to cover it.
Well, folks, as always, I'm Costa Muniz.
And I'm Elissa Koblas, and thank you for watching 30 Minutes in Midlands. Alrighty, and that's it.